Theodore Vance's office was the kind of place that felt more like a museum than a room where someone actually lived. Everything was sleek, sharp, and silent. The enormous windows showed the whole city glittering below his feet, like a kingdom he owned. He was used to holding papers that told him he'd made another million or bought another company. But today, the papers in his hands felt heavy and all wrong. They were report cards, two of them exactly the same. His 10-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, had brought them home from one of the most expensive schools in the city. And they were a disaster. Big, red letters, DS and FS, stared back at him. It wasn't the first time. It felt like the 100th. He let out a long, tired breath. He had tried everything money could buy. The smartest tutors came to the penthouse every afternoon. He hired a special coach who was supposed to teach the kids how to want to learn. He even changed their school twice, but nothing worked. In this giant, beautiful home filled with every toy and game you could imagine, his children were like quiet little ghosts. They didn't laugh much. They didn't talk about their day. They just moved from their expensive bedrooms to their expensive study room, looking unhappy and stressed. He was their father, and he felt like he was failing. But more than that, he was confused. How could his own children, with every advantage in the world, just not understand? Was it stubbornness? Were they not trying? The questions buzzed in his head, making him angry and worried all at once. He looked at a photo on his giant desk. It was from years ago at a beach. The twins were maybe 5, covered in sand, building a castle and laughing with their mouths wide open. He barely remembered that day. He'd probably been on his phone, dealing with work. When did they stop laughing like that? A firm knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was the head housekeeper, a serious woman who ran the home like a general. "You wanted to see the new maid for the East Wing, sir? She's here." "Send her in," Theodore said, his voice back to its usual cool, businesslike tone. He put the report cards down, placing them right on top of his financial papers, as if to remind himself what the real problem was. The woman who walked in was not what he expected. The agency usually sent young people looking for an easy job in a fancy house. This woman was older, maybe in her late 50s. She had a calm face and gentle eyes that quickly looked around the room, not with greed, but with a quiet noticing. Her hands, folded in front of her simple dress, looked like they had done a lot of real work in her life. "This is Eleanor," the head housekeeper said. "She's on a trial period for the East Wing rooms and the children's study suite." Theodore gave her a short, assessing look. "Eleanor,
I'm Theodore Vance.
your primary job is to maintain the twins' study area and their private rooms. Cleanliness, order. It's very important." He picked up the report cards slightly, not showing her, just tapping them on the desk. "My children have significant focus problems. Their environment needs to be perfectly organized to minimize distraction. You are not to engage them in play or chatter. Your job is to maintain the space, not to become a part of it. Do you understand?" Eleanor listened quietly, her eyes meeting his for a moment before she nodded. "I understand, Mr. Vance. To maintain the space." Her voice was soft, but not weak. There was a steadiness to it. As she was about to leave, her gaze drifted past him and landed on that same beach photo on his desk. For just a second, something in her expression changed. A flicker of recognition, a softness. Then it was gone, and she was just the new maid again. "Good," Theodore said, already looking back at his computer screen, dismissing her. "Mrs. Albright will show you the way. Start immediately." As the door closed, the heavy silence settled back into the room. Theodore tried to focus on a contract, but the letters blurred. All he could see were those failing grades. He swiveled his chair to look out at his city, a place he commanded. Yet, in his own home, with his own children, he felt completely powerless. He didn't need a new maid. He needed a miracle. But for now, a maid who followed orders and didn't make things worse would have to do. The east wing of the penthouse was like a separate world. It was where the twins lived, but it didn't feel like a home. The walls were painted a clean, cheerful color, and bookshelves were stuffed with all the right books. science encyclopedias, classic novels, math workbooks that looked brand new. Their study table was huge, made of smooth, shiny wood, with a fancy lamp and neat rows of pens. Everything was perfect and completely lifeless. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the study, her cleaning cart beside her. She took a slow, deep breath, not saying a word. She wasn't just looking at the room. She was feeling it. The air was thick with a quiet kind of unhappiness. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are trying very hard not to be noticed. She got to work. She moved quietly, dusting the shelves, wiping the already spotless table. She was careful, precise, but her eyes were doing a different kind of work. She noticed the small things. The boy's math notebook was open to a page covered in angry scribbles, right over a half-finished problem. The girl's history book was on the floor next to the chair, as if it had been dropped and forgotten. She didn't pick it up right away. She just saw it. Later, from his office, Theodore did something he rarely had time for. He pulled up the security feed for the study room on a small screen in the corner of his desk monitor. He told himself it was to ensure standards were being met. He watched the new Maid move about. She was efficient, he had to give her that. She didn't waste emotion. But he also saw her pause in ways the other staff never did. She stopped in front of a detailed poster of the solar system hanging on the wall. One corner was peeling off. The previous cleaner would have just stuck it back with tape. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment, her head tilted. Then she gently smoothed the corner back, her fingers tracing the painted rings of Saturn for just a second before she moved on. Another time, Theodore saw his son, the boy, sitting at the table, gripping a pencil so tightly his knuckles were white. He was staring down at a page of English questions, not writing. His face was a mask of frustration. Suddenly, he snapped the pencil in two with a sharp crack. The boy looked instantly afraid, like he was waiting for a scolding that would come from somewhere. Eleanor was across the room, polishing a window. She heard the sound. She turned. She saw the broken pieces on the table, saw the boy's tense shoulders. She didn't say, "What did you do?" She didn't sigh or give him a disappointed look. Without a word, she walked over to her cart, opened a small pouch, and took out 3 fresh colored pencils. A blue, a green, and a red. She placed them neatly on the table next to the boy's workbook. Then she simply swept the broken pieces into her dustpan and walked away. The boy stared at the colored pencils. His shoulders slowly sank down from his ears. After a minute, he picked up the blue one. He didn't start writing the English answers. He began to doodle very lightly in the margin of the paper, a little rocket ship. It wasn't the assignment, but the tight, angry line of his mouth softened just a little bit. Theodore, watching from his screen, felt a small jolt of surprise. It was such a small act. It made no sense to him. The pencil was broken, the boy was off task. The response should have been discipline, a reminder of the rules. Instead, this woman had offered a replacement, and quiet. She had offered a quiet way out of the shame. Down the hall, Eleanor continued her work. In the girl's bedroom, she found a model rocket kit, the fancy kind that really launches. It was partly built, but then shoved under the bed, some of the small parts scattered nearby. It looked abandoned. Eleanor carefully pulled it out. She didn't throw it away. She gathered all the little pieces into the box and placed it neatly on the dresser, not hidden, but visible. She was starting to see the story the room was telling. It wasn't a story of laziness. It was a story of things started with hope and then stopped, maybe because they got hard, or maybe because no one was there to share the struggle. It was a story of very lonely pressure. That evening, when Theodore passed the study, the room was spotless. But it felt different. It wasn't just clean. The books on the shelf, while still orderly, seemed less stiffly arranged. The girl's history book was back on the table, but it was open to a page with a colorful picture of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, not a page of dense text. It was a small, silent invitation. Theodore didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't in the job description. He had hired her to clean, not to rearrange, not to understand. A part of him, the part that ran billion-dollar deals, thought he should call her in and reiterate the rules. But another part, the quieter part that looked at the beach photo, hesitated. He decided to watch, just for a little while longer. The following Tuesday, Theodore's schedule cleared unexpectedly. An important meeting in another country was cancelled, leaving him with a hollow space in his afternoon he didn't know what to do with. He decided, with a firmness that felt more like duty than desire, to go home early. He would sit with the twins. He would review their math. He would, as the parenting article said, engage. The thought made his tie feel too tight. The penthouse was in its usual pristine silence when he entered. He could hear the low murmur of the television from the staff quarters, but the main living areas were still. He put his briefcase down and walked toward the east wing, his shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. As he neared the sunroom, a sound stopped him. It wasn't the television. It was a gasp, followed by the sharp plastic clatter of something breaking. Then, a small, choked sob. His daughter's cry pierced the quiet like a needle. It wasn't a loud, angry sound. It was the sound of something precious being lost. Theodore's body went still. He moved closer to the doorway, standing just out of sight. What he saw made his heart sink. The sunroom floor, usually a perfect expanse of cream-colored rug, was a disaster zone. Scattered across it were hundreds of tiny white plastic pieces, spires, and delicate rods. It was the ruins of the International Space Station model, a complex, expensive kit he had brought home a month ago, telling the twins it would be a fun, educational project. He had meant for them to build it together, but time had slipped away as it always did. They had apparently tried on their own. His daughter was on her knees in the middle of the wreckage, her small hands hovering over the pieces as if she could magic them back together. Her cheeks were wet. His son stood a few feet back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face pale and set in a hard, angry mask. He was glaring at the broken model as if it had betrayed him. "It's all ruined," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "It's impossible. It was stupid anyway," the boy muttered, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Theodore felt the familiar surge of frustration rise in his chest. This was it. The carelessness, the lack of follow-through, all that money, that intricate kit reduced to garbage on the floor. He took a breath, ready to step into the room, ready to ask how this could have happened, to point out the cost, to remind them of the importance of being careful with things. But before he could move, another figure entered the scene from the opposite door. It was Eleanor, pushing her quiet cleaning cart. She stopped when she saw the scene. For a long moment, she simply looked. She looked at the shattered pieces. She looked at the girl's tear-streaked face. She looked at the boy's rigid, defensive posture. Theodore held his breath. This was the moment. She would fetch the vacuum. She would give them a lecture about making messes. She would do what he was about to do, and he could then step in and support her authority. It would be a lesson. Eleanor did none of that. She slowly parked her cart to the side. Then, she did something that made Theodore's thoughts screech to a halt. She didn't stand over them. She didn't even look at them with pity. She simply gathered the simple gray fabric of her uniform skirt and lowered herself to the floor, right there on the rug, beside the sea of broken plastic. She moved with a gentle stiffness that spoke of older knees. She was silent for a beat, just looking at the pieces. Then she reached out and picked up a larger fragment, a curved section that might have been part of a module. "Oh," she said, her voice as soft as the room's afternoon light. "The solar panel truss. That's a tricky bit. So many little connectors." The girl sniffled, watching her. The boy's eyes flickered toward the woman, suspicious. "It's ruined," the girl repeated, as if saying it to an adult would make it finally, terribly real. Eleanor nodded slowly, still looking at the piece in her hand. "It's certainly in a new shape," she said. Then she turned her head and looked at the girl, not at her tears, but at her eyes. "You know, sometimes the most interesting things aren't the ones that get built perfect right out of the box." The boy uncrossed his arms a little. "What do you mean?" Eleanor placed the piece carefully on the rug between them. "Well," she began, her gaze drifting to the large windows showing the sky. The people who first dreamed of going to space. They failed all the time. For hundreds of years, they built flying machines that flopped. They drew maps of the stars that were all wrong. She picked up two small pieces that fit together. Click. Every single one of those failures was a teacher. Said, well, that path doesn't work. Let's try another. She looked at the boy. What do you think broke first? When it fell. He hesitated, then pointed to a long, thin rod. That part. It was too wobbly. I see, Eleanor said, as if he'd just delivered a very important report. She handed the rod to him. So, the design had a weakness. Those early astronauts, they learned about metal fatigue the same way. Things broke. They learned. She then began to tell them a story. Not about rockets from a textbook, but about ancient people looking up at the night sky, connecting stars into pictures, a bear, a hunter, a swan. They were just doing connect the dots, she said. Trying to make sense of something huge and beautiful and confusing. That's all any model is, really. Just sensible connect the dots. As she spoke, her hands moved, not to clean up, but to sort. She gently pushed white body pieces into one area, the clear plastic window parts into another, the tiny decals into a pile. It wasn't about fixing it back to the picture on the box. It was about finding a new order in the chaos. Slowly, almost without realizing it, the girl stopped crying. She reached out and started moving pieces too, mirroring Eleanor's sorting. The boy, after another moment, sank down to sit on the rug. He picked up two pieces, trying to see how they might fit a different way. Theodore watched, completely forgotten in the hallway. The speech he had prepared vanished from his mind. He saw the anger melt from his son's shoulders. He saw the despair lift from his daughter's face. He saw them lean in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to see what this woman would say next. She had taken a moment of total defeat and, without a single fancy tool or a dollar spent, had turned it into a beginning. She had sat down in the mess with them. He stood there, a billionaire who could command boardrooms, utterly powerless to interrupt this simple, profound scene. He finally understood what he was witnessing. It wasn't cleaning. It was repair. And it was working on something far more fragile than plastic. Theodore Vance did not step into the sunroom. He couldn't. It felt like moving would shatter the delicate scene playing out on the rug. So he stood there, in the shadow of the hallway, a silent spectator to a lesson he had never learned how to teach. He watched as the three figures on the floor moved pieces of the broken model. It wasn't about rebuilding the space station anymore. Eleanor was asking questions, her voice a calm, curious murmur. What's the most important part of a spaceship? She asked, holding up a rounded piece. The engine, the boy said instantly, his earlier defiance gone, replaced by a focused energy. To go fast? The girl added, nodding. Maybe, Eleanor said. But what about the part that keeps people alive inside? What if we thought about a ship that was mostly a giant greenhouse, floating through the stars, growing food? She placed the rounded piece separately, as if it were the seed of a new idea. The boy's nose scrunched up. That wouldn't work. It needs shields for asteroids. Okay, Eleanor said easily. So we need a shield layer. Find some pieces that look tough. That could be your job. Theodore saw his son immediately start scanning the pieces, his eyes sharp, looking for flat, sturdy panels. He was working, but it didn't look like work. It looked like play of the deepest, most serious kind. Eleanor turned to the girl. And if people are going to live in it for years, what would they need to not go space crazy? The girl thought, her finger tracing the pattern on the rug. Windows, big ones, to see Earth and the stars. And a place for pets. A space dog. A small, real smile touched Eleanor's lips. A space dog kennel module. I like it. See if there are any pieces that look like a good home for a zero-gravity puppy. For 20 minutes, Theodore watched a new spacecraft take shape in the center of the rug. It was lopsided and made of mismatched parts from the old model. It had a shield made of flat panels stacked clumsily, a greenhouse made of clear plastic bits balanced on top, and a little cluster of pieces designated as the dog kennel. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was theirs. Finally, Eleanor carefully placed the last suggested piece. There, she said softly. The Vance Voyager 1 prototype model. It had a failure which taught us about structural weakness. So we redesigned it for long-term life and canine companionship. She said it with such simple respect, as if presenting a real blueprint. The twins looked at their cobbled-together creation. They didn't see broken trash. They saw a story they had built together. Their faces were relaxed, their eyes bright. It was an expression Theodore realized he hadn't seen in years. "I guess we should clean up the extra pieces," the girl said, not with a sigh, but with the tone of an engineer tidying her workshop. "I'll help," the boy said. Eleanor nodded and pulled a small, flat container from her cleaning cart. Not a trash bag, but a plastic bin with a lid. A good idea. Every inventor needs a parts box. You never know when you'll need a spare solar panel truss. She repeated the term she'd used earlier, and the boy smiled, a quick, proud flash. He remembered the word. Together, the three of them placed the remaining pieces into the bin. The mess was gone, but something had been left in its place. A sense of calm, and a strange, lumpy little sculpture of imagination on the rug. Eleanor rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt. "I should get back to the rest of my duties," she said. "You have your tutor for history soon." Normally, the mention of the tutor would bring a cloud over their faces. This time, the boy just glanced at the model. "Maybe we can tell him about why early explorers needed good ships." "Maybe you can," Eleanor said. And with a final, quiet look at their creation, she pushed her cart out of the sunroom, passing right by the hallway where Theodore stood. Unseen that he remained there for a long time, even after the twins had gathered their school things and headed to the study room, chatting softly about shield strength versus window size. He stared at the Vance Voyager 1. Sitting alone on the cream-colored rug, his mind, usually so fast, racing from one problem to the next solution, was quiet. A storm of thoughts and feelings swirled, but they were muted, distant. The main thing he felt was a deep, unsettling shock that he had witnessed a miracle. Not a dramatic, biblical miracle. Quiet, human one. This woman, hired to wipe dust, had walked into a moment of total childhood despair. A moment he himself had been about to make worse with a lecture, and had transformed it. She hadn't used psychology. She hadn't used rewards or threats. She had used curiosity. She had used stories. She had sat on the floor. She saw his children not as problems to be fixed, but as young, frustrated scientists whose experiment had exploded, and she had helped them learn from the explosion. The words he had heard her say echoed in his head. Every single one of those failures was a teacher. All this time he had seen the failed tests, the bad grades, as the end of the story, proof of something wrong. She saw them as the beginning of the story. The first crucial piece of data. He felt a thick, hot emotion rise in his throat. It was shame, mixed with a desperate, soaring hope. He had been so wrong. About everything. About what they needed. About what success looked like. He thought giving them every advantage meant piling on pressure and perfection. She showed him that what they needed was permission to fail, to break things, to imagine something silly like a space dog, and to try again from the broken pieces. The billionaire walked slowly into the sunroom. He crouched down, his expensive suit trousers tightening at the knees. He looked closely at the lopsided model his children had made. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the stacked, shield, panels his son had chosen. He didn't touch it. He just looked. For the first time in a very long time, Theodore Vance was completely, utterly speechless. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was finally listening. And what he had heard and seen had changed everything. The silence in Theodore's office the next morning was different. It wasn't the quiet of emptiness or focus. It was a heavy, waiting quiet. The usual stack of contracts and reports sat untouched. Instead, he found himself just staring at the wall, seeing not the expensive painting, but the image of three people sitting on a rug surrounded by broken plastic. The feeling wouldn't leave him. It was like a key had turned in a lock he didn't even know was there. He thought about calling in the head housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, and asking for Eleanor's file. But that felt cold, like he was investigating a business acquisition. This wasn't business. This was his home. These were his children. He got up and paced. He walked to the window, looking down at the tiny cars moving in orderly lines. His world was built on order, on clear instructions and expected outcomes. What he saw yesterday had no clear instructions. It was messy and gentle, and it worked in a way his order never had. Finally, he made a decision. He wouldn't summon her to his office, that place of power and pressure. He would go to the East Wing. He would find her during her work. He needed to talk to her, but he needed to do it on ground that was neutral. He found her in the twin study, but she wasn't cleaning. She was standing by the bookshelf, holding a thick, dusty world history book. She was carefully wiping its cover with a cloth, but her eyes were scanning the pages she had opened. Theodore stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. She wasn't just dusting the book. She was looking at a map of ancient trade routes. She touched a picture of a spice market with a kind of distant recognition, as if she'd seen something like it before. He cleared his throat softly. Eleanor turned, not startled but calm. She closed the book gently and placed it back on the shelf. "Mr. Vance, is everything all right with the room?" "The room is fine," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, less sure than usual. He stepped inside, his hands in his pockets. He glanced around. The space still looked perfect, but it felt different. The air didn't feel stiff anymore. I wanted to talk to you about yesterday, in the sunroom." Eleanor nodded slowly, folding her dusting cloth. She waited. She didn't look nervous or eager to please. She just looked present, ready to listen. "What you did," Theodore began, then stopped. He struggled to find the right words. "It wasn't in your job description." "No, sir," she agreed quietly. "It wasn't. I watched you," he admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "From the hall. I saw the whole thing." She met his gaze, her expression still calm. "I see. Why?" The question burst out of him, simple and huge. "Why did you do that? They broke an expensive model. They made a mess. You were supposed to clean it up." Eleanor was silent for a moment, thinking. She wasn't thinking of an excuse. She was thinking of an answer. "My job is to care for this home," she said finally. "That was a mess, yes. But the bigger mess wasn't on the rug, Mr. Vance. It was on their faces. The shame. The fear. You can't dust that away. You have to sit with it for a minute." Theodore felt her words land in his chest with a solid weight. The bigger mess wasn't on the rug. "They're afraid of me," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a terrible realization. "They're afraid of failing you," she corrected gently, but firmly. "There's a difference. They love you. That's why it hurts so much. When they look at a hard math problem or a complicated model, they don't just see the puzzle. They see a chance to disappoint you. Their minds, they freeze up. It's like trying to fill a cup that's already full of worry. You have to empty the worry first." "How?" he asked, and in that one word, the powerful billionaire was simply a father asking for help. Eleanor looked around the study. "You give them a different story. Right now, the story they hear is, you must be perfect. You must not fail. That story is too heavy for a child to carry. You change it to, let's see what we can discover. Let's see what happens if we try. Failure just becomes a piece of information, not the end of the world." Theodore walked over to the large study table. He ran his hand over its smooth, cold surface. "All the tutors, the schools, I thought I was giving them everything." "You were giving them everything to succeed," she said. "But you weren't giving them anything to fail with. And failing is most of how we learn anything worth knowing." He turned to look at her. "You speak like a teacher." A faint, sad smile touched her eyes. "I was, for a long time. Not in schools like this. In places where children came with all kinds of struggles. Kids who couldn't sit still, kids who saw letters backwards, kids who were just too sad to think. My classroom wasn't about getting the top grade. It was about finding the one little key that would unlock a mind. Sometimes the key was a story. Sometimes it was just sitting on the floor until the panic passed." Theodore understood now. The calm, the noticing, the quiet authority. It all made sense. Why are you here? As a maid. Her shoulders lifted in a small shrug. Teaching is a young person's game in the way the system runs now. Too many boxes to check. I got tired of checking boxes instead of checking on children. This job, it lets me be around a home. I like caring for a space. And sometimes, she glanced toward the sunroom. Sometimes, you still get to care for the people in it. Theodore looked at this woman, this former teacher, now a maid in his home, and saw the most valuable person in his entire world. He had been searching for an expert, and she had been right here, quietly dusting his shelves. I want you to stop, he said. A flicker of resignation crossed her face. She thought she was being fired. I want you to stop just cleaning, he continued quickly. I want you to be here, in the afternoons, when they come home. I want you to do what you did yesterday, not as a maid, as you. Eleanor studied him, looking for the catch. My job is to clean, Mr. Vance. Your job, he said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, is to help me help my children. I'll speak with Mrs. Albright. Your duties will change. Your pay will reflect that. Please. He added the last word, a word he almost never used. She saw the raw need in his eyes. Not a boss giving an order, but a father surrendering his pride. She gave a slow, single nod. All right, we can try that. The relief that washed over Theodore was immense. For the first time in months, he felt like he had taken a step in the right direction. Not a business step, a human one. He had finally asked for directions, and he had found the guide he needed, right in his own home. The change in the East Wing didn't happen with a bang. There was no announcement, no big family meeting. It happened softly, like the sun shifting its light in the afternoon. The first thing that was different was the schedule. The strict, back-to-back tutor sessions were gently rearranged. There were now longer breaks in between. The note that said, Math, 4 p.m., was replaced by a note that simply said, Discovery time, 4 p.m. The twins were confused when they saw it. The second thing was Eleanor herself. She no longer arrived with her full cleaning cart at 3 o'clock. She came in with a simple tote bag. And she wasn't wearing her uniform. She wore a comfortable sweater and plain trousers. She looked less like staff and more like a grandmother who had come to visit. That first afternoon, she was waiting in the sunroom. The broken pieces of the space station model were still in their parts box in the center of the rug. The twins stood in the doorway, school bags heavy on their shoulders, unsure. Good afternoon, Eleanor said, her voice warm and normal. I was just looking at this prototype of yours. I was wondering about the life support system for the space dog. How does it work? The boy blinked. He put his bag down. Well, it would need air. And water. Would the dog's water float in little balls in zero gravity? The girl asked, curiosity pulling her into the room. That's an excellent question, Eleanor said. How could we find out? That was how it started. Not with a lesson plan, but with a question. From that question came a search on the tablet for videos of astronauts with water in space. From the video came a discussion about spheres and surface tension. From that, the boy ran to get a glass of water and a straw to try and make his own little water droplet, laughing when it dripped on the table. It was messy. It wasn't in a textbook. It was science. Theodore made a point to come home earlier. He didn't hover, but he would find reasons to walk by the sunroom or the study. He watched a new rhythm develop. He saw his daughter, struggling with a history essay on ancient Egypt, close her book in frustration. Eleanor, sitting nearby with some mending, didn't tell her to try harder. She said, "Those pharaohs were obsessed with life after death. What do you think you'd want to bring with you if you were buried in a pyramid for thousands of years?" The girl, annoyed, said, "My tablet. And pizza." Eleanor laughed, a real, warm sound. "Okay, an electronic tablet and a flatbread with cheese and tomato. Now, how would you explain a tablet computer to someone from the Stone Age? What would you call it? How would you describe pizza?" The girl started talking, imagining it. She called the tablet a shiny magic slate that holds all stories. She described pizza as a feast circle. Eleanor picked up a notepad. Why don't you write that down? Just for fun. Describe your magic slate and your feast circle to a Stone Age person. That's what historians do, you know. They translate one world for another. 20 minutes later, the girl had a page of funny, vivid descriptions. It wasn't her essay, but it was writing. And when she went back to the boring essay, the block was gone. She had found a way in. Theodore saw his son, facing a page of fraction problems, grinding his teeth. Eleanor walked over and placed a small pile of plain white buttons on the table next to his paper. She didn't say a word about math. She just said, I need to sort these for a project. Could you help me? If this whole pile is one whole thing, can you separate it into 4 equal parts? It was fractions, but it was with buttons. His son separated them into little piles, counting. Then she asked him to take 3 of those 4 piles. What part of the whole was that? He worked it out with his fingers with the physical buttons. Then he looked at the first problem on his paper. His eyes flickered between the buttons and the numbers. Oh, he said quietly. It's the same. Slowly, the heavy cloud of dread that always hung over homework began to lift. It didn't become easy overnight. They still got frustrated. They still made mistakes. But the mistake was no longer a monster. It was just a wrong turn. Eleanor taught them how to sigh, put down the pencil and say, well, that way didn't work. What's another way? Theodore learned to change his own questions. Instead of, what did you get on your quiz? He learned to ask, what was the most interesting thing you learned today? The first time he asked, they just stared at him, suspicious. But then his daughter said, I learned that water holds itself together in space like a jiggly marble. He didn't know what that meant, but her eyes were bright. So he said, tell me more. He started eating dinner with them, really eating, not just checking his phone. He listened to their jumbled stories about space dogs and ancient feast circles and button math. He didn't correct them. He just listened, and he began to laugh, a sound that felt rusty in his own throat. The billionaire was not running a new company. He was not closing a deal. He was doing something far harder and more valuable. He was learning his own children, and with Eleanor's quiet, patient guidance, he was finally starting to speak their language. It was the language of curiosity, not perfection. And for the first time in a very long time, their home didn't just look perfect. It began to feel happy. The end of the school year arrived not with a bang, but with the soft closing of a book. One evening, a large envelope from the twins' prestigious academy arrived in the mail. Theodore saw it on the hall table, his name printed in formal letters. His stomach, for the first time in months, didn't tighten into a knot at the sight of it. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and carried it not to his office, but into the living room where the twins were showing Eleanor a card game they'd invented. The report cards are here, he said, his voice calm. The game instantly stopped. The boy's shoulders stiffened just a little. The girl's eyes darted from the envelope to her father's face, looking for a sign of the storm that usually followed these letters. The old fear, that deep-rooted worry, flickered in the room for a second. Eleanor simply began gathering the playing cards, her movements slow and unbothered. She didn't look anxious. She gave Theodore a small, knowing glance. Theodore sat down in an armchair. He didn't tear the envelope open with impatient urgency. He opened it carefully, sliding out 2 sheets of thick, official paper. He took a breath and looked. There were no FS, no glaring red DS. Instead, there was a scatter of CS, a couple of BS, and in science for his son, a solid A. But the grades weren't what made his breath catch. It was the comments, written in the teacher's neat script at the bottom of each page. For his son, has shown remarkable growth in perseverance. He now approaches challenges with curiosity rather than frustration. His project on alternative spacecraft design was the most creative in the class. For his daughter, a joy to have in discussions. She has found her voice and contributes unique, thoughtful perspectives. Her historical fiction piece on a pharaoh's tablet was wonderfully imaginative. Theodore read the words twice. They weren't about test scores. They were about his children, their character, their spirit. The very things that had been crushed were now blooming. He looked up. Their hopeful, nervous faces watched him, waiting for the verdict. He didn't say a word about the letters or the grades. He looked at his son. Your teacher mentioned your spacecraft design. Tell me about the best part of it. The boy's face lit up, the fear vanishing. The radiation shield. I figured out a way to layer it using that idea from the water droplets, to make it stronger but lighter. He talked, his hands moving through the air, drawing invisible diagrams. The girl jumped in, explaining her pharaoh's story. Theodore listened, a slow smile spreading across his face. This was the real report card. This excitement, this unbroken stream of ideas later, after the twins had gone to bed, buzzing with relief and pride, Theodore found Eleanor in the kitchen, wiping down the counters one last time. He leaned against the doorway. "Thank you," he said. The words felt huge and too small at the same time. She turned, drying her hands on a towel. "You did the work, Mr. Vance. You changed the weather in this house. I just brought a few seeds." He shook his head. "You brought the soil. We had nothing for anything to grow in before." He paused, looking around the warm, quiet kitchen. "The grades are better, much better, but that's not even the point anymore, is it?" "No," she said softly. "It isn't. The point is they don't feel broken anymore. They feel like discoverers." He nodded, the truth of it settling deep within him. The billionaire had learned that some debts couldn't be paid with money. This was one of them. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not for a job, but as part of this family. To help me keep learning how to be their father." Eleanor's eyes grew a little shiny. She nodded, a simple, accepting motion. "I'd like that very much." The story doesn't end with the twins becoming perfect straight-A students. Life isn't a movie. They still struggled sometimes. They still had bad days. But the fear was gone. The heavy, silent pressure had been replaced by a light, open space where it was safe to try and safe to fail. Theodore kept the report cards, but he didn't file them with his important documents. He put them in a drawer in his bedside table, next to that old beach photo. They were bookends, a reminder of the deep, painful silence before, and the lively, noisy, beautiful learning that came after. He often thought about that moment in the hallway, watching a maid sit on the floor in a mess of broken plastic. He had been speechless then, stunned by a simple act of grace he didn't understand. Now he was speechless for a different reason, filled with a gratitude so deep it had no words. The greatest fortune he had ever found wasn't in a bank. It was in the gentle wisdom of a woman who knew that before a mind can be filled, the heart must be unclenched. And she had taught them all how to open their hands and finally let go.